Hello everybody, and a very warm welcome both to our audience here at Glover Cottages and our online audience to the Australian Institute of International Affairs in New South Wales. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Ross McClellan, who's the Executive Director for Research Services at Macquarie University, is going to deal with a subject that's pretty new to most of us. It's the effect and implications for the universities in Australia of the government's foreign influence legislation of 2020. I'm not going to attempt any kind of comment or summary of his address because it's way beyond me. So it's over to you, Dr. Cullen.
Thank you, Ian, for the invitation to be here today and for that introduction. It's a genuine pleasure to be joining you. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the lands on which this address is being delivered. I pay my respects to their elders and knowledge holders of all traditional peoples who have and who continue to pass on knowledge and wisdom for the sustainability of our environments, our culture, our education and our communities, and I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. A big thank you, I echo Ian's thanks. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you to all of you online who've taken the time to join us for this topic. As Ian says, this is a new topic to everyone, to me as well as to you, and I really want to spend the next half hour talking about international collaboration in research and the impact of new legislation on that and the challenges which the university sector is facing to be able to navigate that high wire act. And as you will all be aware, an essential factor in the success of the Australian university system is its openness to the world. Amongst the multiple benefits that this generates in world-class performance and reputation, it enables Australia to make cutting-edge research breakthroughs as our own world-class academics work in collaboration with others at the forefront of their field across the globe. Indeed, the Australian government actively supports international collaborations through numerous programs and policies across a wide range of initiatives and portfolios. And this crucial international engagement occurs in an ever more complex world. New challenges and threats are evolving globally, including exploitation of digital approaches. For decades, Australia's universities have had strong working relationships with government agencies on security matters and have regularly sought to help safeguard their people, research, systems and intellectual property, as well as to rebuff attempts to breach security. And it's against this backdrop that in late 2019, the federal government released the Guidelines to Counter Foreign Interference in the Australian University Sector. And this document identified key themes and objectives to help universities to manage and engage with risk and to build greater resilience against foreign interference. And subsequently, the government has progressed several new pieces of legislation to support the expectations outlined in these guidelines. Each of these will have a significant effect on universities. And one key change, which I'll focus on later, is the introduction of stringent new reporting requirements around the arrangements and agreements that Australian universities have with foreign entities. So in this address, I will attempt to explore the delicate balancing act for the sector as it works to fortify the current protections against these complex risks, whilst preserving the openness and collaboration that is crucial to the success of Australia's world-class university system. And acknowledging that there are a range of policy issues that impact on the student cohort, a particular focus of this talk will be on potential consequences to Australia's standing as a clever country at the forefront of research and development and the generation of impacts for the benefit of society. Of course, there's nothing new about transnational collaborations in higher education. From their very beginning, academies of higher learning have welcomed scholars from around the world to exchange information and to collaborate on the production of new knowledge. Over recent decades, however, the rationales for forging these partnerships have expanded greatly and are now focused not only on teaching and information exchange, but also on research. An emphasis on research collaborations across national boundaries can now be found in policy statements of most of the leading higher education institutions around the world. And these statements suggest that a globally distributive system of knowledge development and dissemination demands regularized, ongoing, and symmetrical transnational links. In this increasingly globalised higher education sector, international research collaboration has become a key feature of Australian public research policy. In essence, harnessing the potential opportunities that research presents to generate benefits that improve the future for all Australians, as well as to deliver economic value, enhance global reputation, and to deliver policy objectives. When international research teams collaborate, they bring together different cultural perspectives and methodological approaches. They widen the perspective of analysis and interpretation, and such engagement enables the pooling of resources to create larger and more extensive networks of knowledge. International collaboration increases the reach and impact of a country's research and has significant career implications for individual researchers. Much of Australia's success in research has been built upon financial and esteem-based incentives that encourage researchers to produce academic papers. In the university sector, there has been strong evidence that this focus has led dramatically to increase in research productivity. This has been due in part to the success of the federal government's policies, such as the Higher Education Research Data Collection and Excellence in Research for Australia, which deliver not only financial awards, but also contribute to institutional reputation. And such incentives are reinforced by the major funding agencies for project-based activity, the Australian Research Council and the National Health and Medical Research Council. These awards are primarily based on applications and the track record of the researchers who are involved in those projects. It's a widely accepted fact that international research collaboration increases the reach and academic impact of domestic research, as can be measured through proxies such as citations of academic articles or in the patent literature. As just one example, analysis of the normalized citation rates for projects and publications which are funded by the NHMRC, which are authored with and without international co-authors, shows a doubling of the relative citation impact for publications with an international collaborator. So in short, if you have an international collaborator on your project, you've got twice the reach and twice the engagement with the work which you're doing. And such evidence highlights the ability of the Australian government and its funding to mobilise the world's best researchers to work on Australian projects, and for this to translate into greater visibility and peer recognition for Australian research. International collaborations are also an opportunity to showcase research institutions' capacities on the world stage. Besides increased awareness and prestige, international reputation surveys form a significant component of leading world university rankings. And it's on the back of these rankings that Australian universities and other research institutions leverage their reputations in particular disciplines to become a partner of choice for overseas researchers and companies. International relationships facilitate an entree into other audiences and outlets for Australian research and potential access to overseas capital and markets. Indeed, the National Health and Medical Research Council has an international engagement strategy which states the goal of fostering international cooperation to pool resources and talent for complex health and medical research projects that could not otherwise be undertaken. To achieve this, the NHMRC partners with international agencies through bilateral and multilateral programs to fund research with the greatest quality and scientific impact. In 2019, that funding council alone allocated over $20 million for research councils through these schemes, and this investment leveraged almost 5 times that amount from international partner agencies and involved research partnerships with 54 countries. And the same is true of sharing technologies and data collection with international research partners. Large telescopes and particle accelerators, for example, with budgets in the billion-dollar range and timescales for design and implementation of decades, would be out of the question without international cooperation. And such examples show how collaboration enables expensive, large-scale projects to go ahead where no individual nation or funding partner, funding organisation would have sufficient convening power to be able to go alone. And while direct economic investment from abroad into Australian research is desirable in its own right, this is only one of the many economic benefits that flow from international research collaboration. Research and non-research job creation, leveraging domestic funding to attract international funding, encouraging trade and investment opportunities, sharing risks associated with those large infrastructure projects, and getting projects to scale. Such indirect benefits, while difficult to fully account for and to calculate, are significant drivers of investment into this country. Research collaboration can also play an important role in achieving of policy outcomes, exercising soft power, creating and bolstering diplomatic relationships, meeting international obligations such as development aid. In each case, research relations embedded in policy planning act as a means for successful policy outcomes. I could go on, and I've not even mentioned research related to COVID-19, but we're here to discuss, not just for you to listen to me give a background of international engagement with universities. As a final point of context, though, before talking about some recent developments, I want to talk about in terms of who Australian researchers are collaborating with. Over the last 2 decades, a new world order for science and technology has emerged. In 1960, American R&D accounted for almost 70% of the world's total. By 1995, it was down to 40%, and now it sits at around 25%. Even so, in 2017, the US R&D system was still 20 times bigger than Australia's. Now, China accounts for roughly the same share of global science as the US, and is challenging American leadership in key areas such as space, artificial intelligence, energy, and communications technology. Depending on which data you use, China is about to become, or has already become, Australia's largest partner in this field. Of course, the globalization of science, technology, and academic research also brings new risks to national security. Governments and research institutions are increasingly focused on the challenges of illiberal innovation, the risks of foreign interference and undisclosed foreign influence, intellectual property theft, and the application of science and technology by authoritarian governments to uses contrary to democratic values and human rights. Foreign interference has been thrust into the international spotlight after Russia's alleged interference in the 2016 US presidential and 2017 French presidential election campaigns. Again, this is not new. Nations have attempted to interfere in one another's politics for their own benefit since the dawn of history. But 2 new accelerators that have raised fresh alarm in governments are the interconnected nature of the global economy and the use of technology to amplify this interface while keeping it disguised and plausibly deniable. The university sector recognizes that, theoretically, there is a degree of foreign interference in everything that we do. Teaching and learning, research, engagement, all activities of professional and academic staff. And that risk is not only external, but also could be internal to our institutions. Universities understand that risk may be present or may emerge in either established or new relationships to varying extents and in different forms. And perhaps unsurprisingly, corroborated details of specific examples of actual foreign interference in Australia's universities are hard to come by. According to the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, and the Australian Federal Police, with foreign governments seeking to get inside knowledge of Australian research and technology, the higher education and research sector is considered to be at one of the at-risk parts of the community. The head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, has gone as far as to say that the scale of foreign interference in universities today is higher than at any time since the Cold War, and has revealed that ASIO had in excess of 60 engagements with universities last year. ASIO have provided 4 anonymized examples of incidents that they are aware of in our university system. Firstly, that researchers and their families have been threatened or intimidated by actors seeking to have the sensitive research provided to a foreign state. That universities have been threatened through financial coercion should critical research continue in Australia. Instances where academics have self-censored their course material in order to avoid adverse outcomes such as cuts to foreign funding or threats from individuals who may be linked to a foreign government. And finally, attempts to steal sensitive Australian intellectual property as part of cyber compromises. Of specific relevance to universities has been the attention recently in the media on international talent programs. These talent programs broadly take the form of academic awards that require a researcher to affiliate with the awarding institution, to spend time overseas, to receive payment, to gain access to high-value information or data, or to gain other professional benefits. And some talent programs provide funding for researchers to establish and run labs overseas. And there are, of course, many legitimate and well-recognized programs to support international academic exchange and the global research enterprise that could be described as talent programs. They're a fundamental component of how international research happens. However, Recent analysis of some of China's talent programs suggests that some programs operate through recruitment of international academics to expand China's strategic interests. Concerns have been raised that talent programs may increase the risk of covert foreign interference or may lead to the leakage or the threat of Australian-funded research in intellectual property or strategic technologies. The evidence around this is very scarce. However, universities view these concerns seriously and typically include recruitment to talent programs as part of its ongoing program of due diligence and risk management. Specific issues remain a rare occurrence in the public discourse in this country. In the USA, however, national security officials have brought a number of criminal cases relating to membership of foreign talent programs against researchers and students from a variety of institutions across that country. In fact, and this won't be a surprise, universities have a long history of working alongside government departments and security agencies to counter foreign interference. In recent times, universities have heard the call from the security agencies regarding the increased levels of threat around foreign interference in Australia, and they have experienced firsthand the impacts of it through incidents such as large-scale cybersecurity breaches. Productive relationships have been built between agencies and the sector as a whole and with individual institutions over many years, and universities continue to look to the intelligence agencies as their primary source of information regarding the scale and extent of threats, for they have resources which are an expertise which is far beyond the scope of universities. Excuse me, that's the coming of winter. As I have indicated, the success of universities is predicated on our ability to engage and to collaborate with international partners. In managing their collaboration, universities are conscious that our connected world presents not only opportunities, but also risks. And whilst the threat of foreign interference has risen in recent years, universities have a long history of managing their international engagement in a national security context. Universities continue to build on such successes in partnership with government to further strengthen their resilience to foreign interference. Existing requirements include, but are not limited to, the Defence Trade Controls Act, the Export Controls Act, the Foreign Influence and Transparency Scheme Act, the Autonomous Sanctions Act, and updating the government on foreign interference activities through the Compacts Agreement between the Commonwealth and higher education providers. The geeky side of me could make a much longer list, but I think that's enough for you to understand that there's an awful lot of legislation which is covering this space. As one example is the close work between government and the university sector on the Defence Trade Controls Act. Universities continue to have systems and checks to ensure compliance with defence-sensitive technologies, and feedback from government officials suggests an abundance of caution and over-reporting to government agencies rather than a dearth. However, the regulatory and legislative requirements on universities continue to grow, and a clear expression of this has been the establishment of the University Foreign Interference Task Force, or UFIT, which comprises both government and university representatives. Soon after its commencement, UFIT released the guidelines to counter foreign interference in the Australian university sector, and both of these initiatives, UFIT and the guidelines, are recognised by our international counterparts as examples of best practice. The guidelines were released in November 2019, and this document identified key themes and objectives to help universities to manage and to engage with risk and to build greater resilience against foreign interference. They contain an emphasis on educative and policy responses to assist risk assessment and to promote mitigation strategies, as well as recognition for the need for proportionality and a continuous improvement approach. Universities have actively embraced this direction and all the directions provided in the guidelines. And in a moment, I will touch on some examples of the work which has been done in recent years to engage on these issues. However, in addition to the guidelines, to bring them to life, so to speak, there are major pieces of legislation which have been recently enacted or currently under consideration, which intersect with the expectations outlined in this document, and each of these will have significant effect on universities. As an example, and as Ian alluded to, late last year, the government proposed legislation to regulate the dealings with overseas governments and institutions by state and territory governments and their associated entities. And this is the Australia's Foreign Relations Act, which was passed into law on the 8th of December 2020. I'm sure that you will be aware of the reach and the impact of this Act after the Foreign Minister recently acted under this instrument to cancel the Victorian government's Belt and Road agreements with China, along with 2 other agreements between that state and Iranian and Syrian entities. Universities were a late inclusion into this legislation, seemingly on the basis that universities are large, they might be doing something of concern, nobody's sure what, so let's capture everything and see what we can find. And I'll come back to the details and the impact of this Act in more detail later. In addition to that piece of legislation, in its proposal for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission, the government's aim is to establish a centralised agency to investigate criminality and corruption in the public sector, and the proposed legislation captures public universities. Universities would be open to investigation for breaches of law under, for example, the Autonomous Sanctions Act, the Biosecurity Act, the Defence Trade Controls Act, and the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act. And whilst, of course, the concept of an Integrity Commission is to be supported, there are several issues with the inclusion of universities in the scope of this proposed commission, including that the policy rationale for the inclusion of universities is unclear. Matters of corrupt conduct covered by the draft bill are already offences under other acts, which already have appropriate powers of investigation, compliance, and prosecution. This burden does not seem to be proportionate to the relative risk and would come at the expense of core activities in universities of teaching, research, and community engagement. Also, as drafted, the threshold for corrupt conduct for universities is lower than any other entity proposed to be regulated by the bill. In the case of higher education providers, corrupt conduct need only constitute a listed offence, including such broad terms as any offence under any relevant state or territory act. How this is consistent with a reasonable definition of corruption is unclear to me. In addition, the Security Legislation Amendment, Critical Infrastructure Bill of 2020, is currently under review. This proposed legislation will allow the Minister for Home Affairs to declare assets as critical infrastructure, to require risk management programs for such assets and notification of cybersecurity incidents, and to set limits on the use of such assets and to impose civil penalties where appropriate. Both the higher education and research and the health and medical sectors are included in the legislation's list of critical infrastructure sectors. Importantly, the whole university or hospital would be regarded as a critical asset. The intention, of course, is to protect such sectors against both natural and human-induced hazards. There are potential problems, given both the wide extent of proposed ministerial discretion and because of potential impacts on academic freedom. There are also concerns that if the legislation is implemented as drafted, it may deter industry from collaborating with universities. This legislation is expected to be passed and details of the implementation settled by the middle of this year. Recent indications from the Department of Home Affairs are, fortunately, that their recommendation is likely to be that the only asset of university, or the only aspect of universities which be actively covered by this legislation at this stage, be the mandatory reporting of cyber breaches, which is eminently sensible. The university sector awaits the progression of this bill with bated breath. In parallel with these current legislative steps, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security has commenced an inquiry into national security risks affecting the Australian higher education and research sector. This inquiry was prompted by the Minister for Home Affairs and includes in its terms of reference a focus on the university sector's awareness of foreign interference, undisclosed foreign influence, data theft and espionage, and its capacity to identify and respond to these threats. That committee is due to report imminently, and for those of you who have viewed it, the hearings were at time combative. Senate estimates has nothing on a parliamentary inquiry. The cumulative impact of all of the foreign interference-related measures is as yet unclear, but is expected to be significant. The guidelines developed by UFIT have served as the basis for strengthening university policies, practices and procedures on countering foreign interference. Universities over the last 12 to 18 months have been active across all key themes, notwithstanding the impact of COVID-19 on their operations. And needless to say, there is substantial work which is being done to tighten cybersecurity at universities, and a strong focus which is being implemented on communication and education. To strengthen governance and risk frameworks, universities have ensured that they have policies, structures and frameworks in place to promote and strengthen a culture of security and resilience to foreign interference. Many universities, including my own, have established a Foreign Interference Committee, working group or equivalent, which is championed and chaired by a Deputy Vice-Chancellor. Membership of these groups includes representation from all corners of the university, from human resources, information technology, legal, risk, research support, to make sure that they have oversight of the overall framework to counter potential foreign interference and to ensure an integrated cross-organisational approach. It also reviews projects with high exposure to foreign interference risk. Also, due diligence has been further upregulated from its existing levels, with the objective of ensuring that the nature and purpose of collaboration with international entities is transparent, is undertaken with full knowledge and consent, and is in a manner that avoids harm to Australia's interests. Agreements with international partners are screened to ensure that they comply with Australian law and that they address potential threats to the integrity of research and the reputation of the university, and identify emerging or potential risks, including any foreign interference and security risks. As I hope you can see, universities are aware of foreign influence issues, are proactive in addressing them, and are taking a responsible approach, while, importantly, defending and supporting the notion of research and discovery remaining fundamentally a global and shared endeavour. Every university can point to specific examples where it has chosen not to undertake research activity due to the combination of topic or partner. Now, returning, before I conclude, to the requirements of the Australia's Foreign Relations Act. This new legislation requires that a public university must notify the federal government when entering into any agreement with a foreign government entity or a foreign university that does not have institutional autonomy. The government may then choose to veto the agreement on the basis that it would adversely affect Australia's foreign relations or would be inconsistent with Australia's foreign policy. Now, I'm sure that many of you have formed a version of the exclamation, "But Ross, there's many aspects of that statement which require further definition," to which my response would be yes, there is very little which is completely clear. And herein lies a challenge for universities, being the scope covered by these definitions. First, in terms of what foreign entities are included, it encompasses all national and state governments and their departments or agencies, including international funding bodies. And it also includes any foreign university that does not have institutional autonomy. That is, that they could be deemed to be under the control of a foreign government. Secondly is the definition of arrangement, which extends to any formal and informal written agreement, or written arrangement, agreement, contract, or understanding that is between a foreign entity and the Australian and a Australian university, including someone who could reasonably be considered to be acting on behalf of the institution. Now, a formal arrangement is an easy thing to identify. Universities have well-established due diligence processes and authority, a delegated authority for signing, and they're often captured in some central repository. Informal arrangements, on the other hand, could be email exchanges where two academics agree to convene a conference on their particular research topic. And as you can imagine, this latter category is much more numerous, and they tend not to be held in a central repository. As of the 10th of March this year, universities had to submit details of all prospective arrangements which fell within these definitions. As you can imagine, there has been significant awareness-raising activity across the sector to adapt to this new requirement. In addition, the second initial obligation for universities is before the 10th of June to declare all of the active arrangements which they have struck with foreign entities that fall within the scope of the Act. A new task force in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade will then review these before the Foreign Minister decides on their continuation or whether she exercises her right to veto. Literally, as I talk to you now, an army of people across Australia's universities are finalising their search of databases, of research, of engagement, of general collaboration to identify those that, according to these broad criteria, require reporting to DFAT. Final numbers aren't yet known. Come back to me in a week and I will tell you. But it's anticipated that the total number of existing foreign arrangements across the sector will be in the region of 10,000 to 15,000. These will all require review and will await a decision as to whether they're able to continue or they will be vetoed. As I've mentioned, we're in the early days of observing the impact of this legislation, and needless to say, the concern is not only on the significant administrative burden which is being imposed, but also ensuring that there is no chilling effect on the research with international partners. Whilst the vast majority of research is not impacted by this piece of legislation or the overall focus on countering foreign interference, across the sector we are already hearing of reports being shared where partners have downgraded the scope of the collaboration, citing the risks of commencing research that may be subsequently vetoed. Without having any examples of precedents for what activities will or will not be allowed to continue by the government, it is difficult to allay these fears completely. Also, there are early signs of self-censorship amongst some aspects of the research community, where researchers are looking to maximise how they spend their finite time and are worried that the compliance burden is too weighty for them to pursue collaboration with some countries. We are also seeing funding agencies compiling their own dossiers on researchers and their possible interactions with foreign entities. Those of us in a position to facilitate research work to minimise these burdens, to put in place protections, and to continue with our education and awareness raising to explain the global context whilst working to reassure researchers and partners that their work is valid and supported. For now, we wait and see, so please watch this space. In conclusion, Australian universities are a key national resource. Unlike physical resources, they provide limitless potential through the generation of ideas that enable society and the economy to continuously improve. Universities also provide our graduates with the education and skills to navigate not just the challenges of the present, but the unknown of the future. Our world, notwithstanding the events of the past year, is a globally interconnected system. The ability of a country to deliver on its social and economic aspirations is strongly related to its ability to effectively connect with the world around it and to utilise the knowledge and resources it finds to its advantage. There are few industries or endeavours that match the interconnected nature of the global research system. Globally, in excess of $2 trillion is invested in research every year. Australia represents about 1% of this expenditure. In knowledge generation terms, we generate 4.2% of the world's scientific publications, but comprise only 0.3% of its population. We make the most of every dollar invested and boost our impact through global connections. Domestically, universities perform 90% of the research in Australia. This is where new ideas spring from, and universities drive not only the basic research that provides some of the most transformative breakthroughs, but also the applied research which enables the translation of the ideas into services, products, and systems that underpin every aspect of our lives. The additional legislation is well-intentioned to protect Australia's national interests, but implementation has the potential to negatively impact on Australia's capabilities in research and development and the standing of our universities. This is the reality that faces all publicly funded institutions, which of course also face the challenge of shortfalls in revenue due to the contraction of international student enrolments. But that would be the topic of a whole other address, and I look at the time, so I will now thank you for your attention and hand over to Ian for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. Fascinating. For our online audience, do feed in your questions through the Q&A function on Zoom. And of course, for the people here in the hall, we have a microphone standing by. I have one, if I may, just to start the ball rolling. You mentioned that the Parliamentary Committee on Intelligence and Security, so often described as the powerful Committee on Intelligence and Security, had a combative discussion, and I must admit I don't know anything about that. Can you tell us a bit more about the combat?
I think that's a very good question, Ian. You'll forgive me if I choose my words carefully. I think the entree into that parliamentary committee is the situation, the diplomatic relationship between China and Australia. It happens at a time where there is a lot of focus on the foreign interference and foreign influence which is happening in Australia. A prelude to the parliamentary inquiry was the issues which have happened at some of Australia's universities around freedom of speech, particularly around China and some other ones, University of Queensland being a great example. So that the conversation and the debate of the parliamentary inquiry when university representatives were called was a starting point of accusations from the members of the panel that universities didn't know what they were doing and were taking Australian investment and sharing it freely around the globe. It's my interpretation of the starting point of that. So it was very much a defensive position, and as I outlined in my address, describing the steps which universities have taken for decades to make sure that we're providing due diligence and risk mitigation to all of those engagements. So the combat wasn't exactly hand-to-hand, but was around the philosophical starting point of the benefit that comes from international collaboration and how important that is, and sort of defending the position of universities that doing research and performing education is an interconnected and a global endeavour.
Thank you. We have a question from here from our councillor Christopher Skinner.
Thank you, Dr. McLennan, for a most incisive and informative talk, which I shall study, as will many people, including those online, to look at the detail of the very informative and comprehensive talk that you've given. My question, though, relates to some definitions, but before I make the question, I do empathise with all this red tape that's being created for universities. I think it's highly regrettable, and I don't necessarily think it will achieve the goals that the legislators set out. My question, though, is what do we really mean by foreign interference? Are we talking about an individual academic who has a real passion on a subject and he happens to be foreign and so on? Or are we really talking about a government that is influencing a collective approach to a research area? And is that perhaps what the legislation was intended to deal with, rather than the inspiring and innovative activities of international researchers working together?
That's a very good question, thank you. And my short answer is that it should definitely be the latter. I think it's the potential for foreign states, foreign actors to unduly influence research which is happening in this country, and to take the outputs of that research and use it for their own purpose without further engagement or due recognition or control from the people that have carried it out. I think the intent of the legislation is to address the latter, is to have in place some formal checks and balances that for those areas of research, those areas of collaboration which are on sensitive topics, to allow to force universities and to allow government to have oversight of what's being done with whom, and to make a conscious national decision as to whether that's something we want to do. And it's that combination of the who and the what which is really important. How the legislation is being interpreted and implemented is taking it much wider than that, and it does get down to that level of, two researchers that are looking to collaborate on a cool and interesting research idea, having unfortunately to navigate the bureaucracy that goes alongside that. These things are always cyclical. We're at the start of this journey. I'm hopeful that we'll get back to the intent of the legislation, but in the meantime we have to navigate the current implementation.
Thank you. We have a question online.
That's a very good question. I think that's a question of Tom's own rather than it's online. I should say that I do know that in the UK my mum is watching, so if that's a question from you, Mum, then you have been paying attention to what I've been talking to you about for the last year. How can universities influence? Universities individually and through the peak body Universities Australia are having really active conversations with governments, and particularly through the Universities Foreign Interference Task Force, UFIT, which is a body where the university sector and government and defence and the security agencies are sitting side by side to look at the holistic topics around governance and risk management and due diligence, and identifying what's the best practice which can be implemented in universities, and the gap being the legislation. So the approach which I think universities are taking is engaging with those guidelines, is to demonstrating and articulating all of the work which is being done in universities with a view to demonstrate that the current situation is fit for purpose and that there is enough control and enough oversight of what's happening. In terms of the current legislation, once legislation is enacted, we need to live with what's there, and it's around the implementation. Universities are having frequent conversations with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who are implementing this, to pose questions around those definitional aspects. Something which is written down around a foreign entity or a written arrangement is open to a whole range of interpretation, and there is a genuine two-way conversation around how we can interpret that and how we can make that practical as we move into the future. Universities do not want to spend all of their time submitting notifications to DFAT, and I'm sure DFAT don't want to be receiving notifications which are not in line with, as the previous question, the intent of the legislation.
A question here in Sydney from Dr. Robin Fitzsimmons.
Thank you very much for a lovely talk. I suppose coming to the President's comments earlier, and a question about the combative Senate estimates position that's starting off in terms of loss of intellectual property. Comment might be maybe Senate estimates might put that in a broader context, beyond that even of foreign interference, about the loss of intellectual property to friendly countries, to wit the United States particularly, when we commercialise too soon and lose our intellectual property over our own inventions, which is a very sad situation, particularly in the medical field. But a question in relation to the definitions that you mentioned of autonomous or non-autonomous, I'm sorry I've paraphrased there, I think, university, one that's free from government interference. Well, theoretically, most Western universities like to think of themselves as being autonomous. So you've got a grey scale, the semi-autonomous, and at the one end you've got Harvard, and such like universities in the United States, which are presumably as free as can be free of government interference. On the other hand, you've got those in China, the other end of the spectrum, and in the middle you've got perhaps places like Cambridge, which is also in the news for totalitarian interference or asserted interference since the Second World War, and indeed very recently. So what's your view on what might be a non-autonomous or autonomous university in terms of the proposed definitions?
Thank you for that question. I will come back to the commercialisation topic, because that's a whole extra thrust of government at the moment. But in terms of the question around institutional autonomy, you're absolutely correct. I mean, every university in the world is beholden to government in some way or another, whether that's for funding, whether that's through their creation, through an act of a state or a federal government. In terms of this specific act, institutional autonomy is really looking at three aspects. Is there anything in the governing documents of the institution or in the national law, which means that the governing body of the institution must have people from a particular political persuasion in there. So, the obligation to have the government's people on the governing council is one way which would fall foul of that definition. Secondly is around educational and research freedom. Is it defined in the statutes of the organisation or in national law that the topics of activity, the fundamental workings of a university must be to a particular doctrine? The third one again is connected into that, is how much control is in the national education laws around a particular institution. So they're all very specific definitions, but they're all really difficult to find. I don't know if you've ever tried to find the governing documents of a university or every law of a particular country which is written in interesting languages to be able to interpret really specific questions around institutional autonomy. And I think the challenge which the university sector finds itself in, is that there's clearly a number of actors which the government is concerned about, but the government is not sharing a list of particular countries or particular institutions which it has concerns around. If we had that, so in the UK, who are potentially following on a similar route that Australia has done, there's a number of policy papers which are encouraging the UK government to effectively publish a list of the institutions that should not be collaborated with on particular topics, to provide a really clear-cut set of guidelines to universities. In the absence of that, and particularly as we're starting on this journey, it becomes down to the individual institutions to make a determination as to whether a collaborator is a foreign entity, including a university of without institutional autonomy. In a period of time when the minister has made some rulings on what is and is not allowed, we'll start to build that body of evidence where we've got test cases of which countries, which institutions can fall within that. Briefly on the topic of commercialization, that's a really interesting and insightful observation. I think we need, as universities are increasingly aware of the value, both in a positive and a negative perspective, defending it against foreign interference, but the positive in terms of delivering value to Australia from the outcomes of research. And there's a really important piece of work which is ongoing as to how we as a nation can make sure we deliver the maximum benefits of that in Australia, rather than, as you say, selling it too early and too cheaply to overseas organisations. And how can we look at the industry makeup in this country to make sure we've got those bodies which can then take on the outputs from universities and can generate economic value here in Australia.
Thanks. Our next question comes online.
Yes, foreign interference is one of many pieces of legislation which impact on university research, and the good universities, of which I of course include my own, are taking a proactive approach of supporting our researchers to navigate this. That this is education and awareness. As I mentioned in my address, the vast majority of research which is conducted at universities is not subject to this particular legislation. And it's reinforcing the position that a university values its research and its research done in collaboration with international partners. And the approach is not to place the burden onto the individual researchers. The obligation of a researcher is to understand if their research requires some further investigation, and then to make sure that we have expertise, in the case of Macquarie University, within the research office, to help researchers to understand that, to navigate that, to make a determination on their behalf as to whether their partner is something that falls within the scope of this particular act. The same is true whether that is for contract negotiation or whether that is for ethics approval. Universities are increasingly, and rightly so in my perspective, supporting researchers to navigate that and providing the tools for them to do that, rather than that being a sole obligation on the individual researcher. They should be spending their time on cracking these interesting and important global questions rather than filling in paperwork. We need to have less paperwork filling in, but we need to support them and to make that as easy as possible to do business with.
Our next question comes where? In the room or online? Online.
So I had an interesting question beforehand when I was talking to the interns and asking in my experience, had I come across any examples of foreign interference, which is what the Act is driving at, and honestly my answer was no. I mean, and whether that's because I've not seen it, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I think there is it's a proportionality question. I think the majority of research that's being done is being done with international collaborators who have the right intent and are working together to be able to solve a particular challenge. I think that the amount of rigour which is put around due diligence and risk management at the universities even before this new legislation is sufficient to deter people who are coming through the front door to be able to interact with universities. Of course, in any sector, if people want to skulk in the shadows, it's really difficult to find, but universities in Australia require their researchers to enter into contracts. Researchers do that so that they can demonstrate the impact they're having, they can demonstrate the collaborations they're having, they can show the publications, they can show the income so that they can demonstrate their track record, which is good for their promotion, for their success in securing funding. So the Australian researchers are driven to do that. And if any overseas collaborator wanted to engage with universities, they would, I think, quickly be deterred as they have to go through a formal process of contract negotiation and establishment.
And you have another one online? Yeah. And
In true Yes Minister style, I will say that I couldn't possibly comment.
are you aware of those cases where people are not able to send students to Vietnam, for example?
At the moment, sending people anywhere is a challenge for other decisions of government.
Yes, Humphrey.
I think that there's examples where universities, I think every university can point to an example where they haven't done a particular activity. Another university was informing me of a decision they've had recently where they had a potential HDR candidate, so a PhD candidate had come to them and wanted to work on a particular topic with a particular university from their home country. And the nature of the topic with the location of that institution meant that the university declined the offer of taking on that student and carrying out that project. And I think they're the pragmatic decisions which the university are making. I think that there's clear-cut things where it's a sensitive topic, potential dual use in terms of technology or something which is really at the forefront of particular challenges, those sensitive technologies. Doing those with countries which are not considered to be on the safe list, for want of a better expression, is something that universities won't do. It's that grey area which is around exchange of students, it's around the collaboration, around supervision, around scholarship. Or the creation of conferences, working together on publications of research which has come out from different countries. That's coming back to a previous question, I don't believe is the intent of the legislation, and we need to sort of make sure that we can protect that as much as we can do in the current policy settings.
Thank you. Next question. Dr. Robert Howard from Council.
Thanks very much for your address. I must admit, though, I've been teaching in the universities for about 40 years, and I'm feeling somewhat left out. It seems to me that your observations are very much science and particularly medical science orientated. How does all of this relate to research in the social and political sciences? It seems to me that it's a case of this old argument between how you assess the hard sciences and how do you assess the soft sciences or the humanities and the social and political sciences. Can we assume that they're off the board, as it were, that we are speaking about the hard sciences, and when you talk about the international dimension, clearly one can imagine a viable collaboration between players from different parts of the world in discussing hard sciences. Where do the other sciences, and I'm assuming that I am engaged in science of one sort or another, I taught international relations, and there are many scientific approaches to that discipline. But where does this approach by the government fit into all of this in this particular area?
That's a very good question, and apologies if my language has been down to medical. My background is in sort of medical and technical science, so my default is to use those words, whilst my intent is around all research. And should have had a disclaimer. Sometimes I use science when I mean research in its broadest sense, because everything is about inquiry and scholarship in my head. This comes to a fundamental aspect of the legislation and the difference between the requirement to notify and the decisions to, or the permission, if you like, to continue. The legislation is written in a very broad sense. The point of notification is around who you're interacting with, which applies to politics collaborations as much as it does to engineering collaborations. What will then determine whether there is a decision to veto or to amend an agreement will be down to the content of the particular activity, so the what you're doing. So if I can sort of draw two examples, you could have a collaboration between an Australian university and a government entity in an overseas country, where the Australian government decides that an agreement between those two entities in the topic of ancient history is okay, and that can carry on. It's been notified and it's been reviewed, and the content is deemed not to be contrary to Australia's national interests, so it can carry on, or against the foreign policy. You could have the same agreement with maybe the same terms in the agreement between the same two institutions in Australia and overseas, but in an engineering topic, or a lasers or photonics or something which is considered to be sensitive, and the government can step in and say that would be contrary to Australia's national interests, which could be a security issue, or it could be an economic issue in terms of where that they see the value lying. So it's as we move forward with this, we're at the cutting edge. As I've said before, the 10th of June is a date which has been writ large and red on my calendar as when we need to submit all of this information. I'm sure it's the same from the government. That's when they're going to see the full extent of the notifications which the university sector has been made. The interesting point to me comes when we start to see the outcomes of those things which have been allowed to continue, and those things where there has been a request for an amendment or a veto of those agreements. It will be only then that we'll start to dig into the real substance behind some of these questions, as to it's not just the who you're interacting with, it's the what you're doing with them that's really important, and the why you're doing it. Why is the question which is driving us at the universities. Why do you need that partner for that research project?
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to wind up at that point. Let me mention that our event next week, Tuesday the 15th of June, will be an address here at Glover Cottages by Dr. Dermot Maguire from Sydney University. His topic will be the worrying implications for Northern Ireland and for the United Kingdom as a whole of the next steps with Brexit. But to round off this evening, one of our interns, Adjua Asan, would like to move a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. McLennan, for addressing the Institute this evening on the challenge for Australia's universities in balancing collaboration and security. You spoke of the limitless potential of universities and the transformative breakthroughs that spring from the research space. Noting the economic and policy benefits, whilst also exploring the threats presented by foreign interference, including to intellectual property, research integrity, and national security. You shared your insights on the new legislative developments and their being well-intentioned but somewhat unclear and broad in scope. You emphasised that these laws will have a significant effect on universities and invited us to watch this space. You provided thoughtful answers to questions, including ones regarding the Research Parliamentary Committee convened on foreign interference, what is actually meant by the term foreign interference, how legislative changes can be made research-friendly, commercialisation, and the impact of the government's approach on the soft and hard sciences. We are reminded that a balance must be drawn between protecting our academic institutions from interference and maintaining collaboration essential for research and innovation, as well as global engagement. Please join me in thanking Dr. McLennan.